I'm going to invite our speaker, our keynote speaker up. I invite you to listen to his words. Some of it's not going to be surprising because obviously we're all here, right? But what's going to be surprising, I think, is the magnitude of the problem and how long it's been going on, right? I think that that's what's going to help hopefully motivate us for solution and action moving forward. So Tim Cornwell has been working on this project for 9-10 months. He's a national expert with 20 years experience delivering best-in-class research. Tim and his team have worked closely with us and other community leaders learning about the problem in Cape Cod, not just the data, but they use the data and the trends to explain some of the micro and macro challenges that we're facing today. Please welcome Tim. Thank you.
I think the magnitude of the problem can be very well reflected in the number of people in the room today, right? We know that there's an issue. We know that this needs to be solved, and it needs to be solved soon. So as we talk about sort of our role in this process and what we've seen within the data, before we even talk about slides and the individual local data, I want to give a little bit of a national perspective, sort of where we are within housing markets and the level of disruption that we've seen, honestly, within the last 36 months during COVID, okay? And so in addition to this health crisis that we've all been dealing with, right? In addition to a situation where economies have changed massively, the nature of doing work and the locations of doing work have changed massively. We also have a demographic context that we as a country need to pay attention to, right? Effectively, I've done a speech actually about 16 years in a row, okay, in our housing work around what a millennial wants from a housing choice perspective. Okay, we've been talking about this for many, many years. But as we think about where we are within that cycle, I need to brief everyone that that person, that peak individual, many of your kids are turning 31, 32, 33 years old right now. Okay, so the debate's really around what they have been wanting, where they have been, how they've been housed, right? The nature of the income disparities that are going on has a lot to do with the fact that, when we look at that individual, they're now getting to a place where it's time to start families. It's time to start putting down roots, right? It's time, historically, to enter home ownership years. And there's huge challenges for that individual across the whole of the United States. The average net worth for households under 35 in the United States is $6,682. Okay, so there is no way that person can get to down payments, no less pay mortgage amounts with these rapidly rising prices. So when we talk about the housing balance, the housing crisis, the context that we're seeing historically, right? These disruptions around, second home ownership and the Zoom culture and how people can work remotely and the rise of these resort and recreational markets as a place to live more full time, displacing those individuals. Remember, it's your kids in many cases. We're talking about your kids, their ability to live in those communities where they've grown up, right? And have their own roots over a long period of time. I'm actually from California. This has been a long road that we've traveled in California, Northern California, for many decades. And I can make the point that, I can drive around my neighborhoods and tell you within a couple years when you moved into your house based on the car in your driveway, right? It's very much a moderate income place on top of which global wealth and affluence has been delivered, right? So I know what happens when we don't solve these housing issues, when we don't build enough for the demand, and when we see that substitution play out, in our communities. Okay, so I'm going to share some slides with you all, and then we'll have some time for some questions. Obviously, we created a very deep dive through all the data, the analytics, what I very lovingly call the dorkitude of what my job is and what we do. So I'm more than happy to answer any questions as we go through, but I'm going to share some slides just to give us some of the magnitude of the problem and some facts, ideally, that we can center on and have some consistency with in our conversation. This is a map of growth that's projected really over the next several years within Cape Cod, okay? And basically what we're doing here is we're scaling this by individual submarkets and geographies based on that net household growth that's happening every year for the next 5 years. Okay, when we look at this collectively, we're doing, roughly speaking, as I get into the actual data, right, we're doing, roughly speaking, 0.1% net growth every calendar year. Okay, everywhere that you are in red, you're at 0.6% growth per year or higher, and everywhere else is actually below that typical 0.6% growth every single calendar year. Okay. And so what we need to look at here is only the submarkets that exist in red are anywhere close to the kind of typical net new replacement growth that we need, that we're seeing really, frankly, mostly in the United States. Okay. And so when we look at this, the US curve, right, population and demographic growth has been, roughly speaking, 1% per year for 30 years. And we're now seeing that start to decline in so many of our submarkets around that housing choice and housing availability issue. Okay. As we go to the next page, I'll deal with some of the income disparities and demographics that exist, in this environment. As we look at this, I want to point you to that red line that you can probably barely see at the top end of that table, right? When we look at what's happening across the county as a whole, okay, that 0.1% growth is actually only 80 families on a net new basis every single calendar year. That's in the context of the 100,000 households that exist, within this environment as a whole, okay? But when we look at that 80 families of net growth, what's happening is you have a very, very interesting income disparity, okay? That's derived by 900 net new households every calendar year, over $100,000 of household income, and a physical loss or displacement, those people that are being pushed out, if you will, of some 830 households or families every single year, right? So if you think about this room, right, it's double the number of people that are in this room, right? Easily, when we look at that displacement happening under $100,000 of household income. Right. And so the have and have not distribution of this economy is really clear as it relates to our near-term future. Okay. There's all kinds of other discussions that we need to talk about, right? I might actually go back a page and just say that the median age now, 54 years old, right? The aging of this economy, right? The rapid need of care moving forward. Right. I heard an NPR story years ago that almost made me crash my car as I was listening to this. It was an 85-year-old woman who was talking about how much increases in care were burdening her economic situation. And they interviewed her caregiver, who was 83 years old. Right. So as we talk about what's next, we need to have that backfill. We need to have the job market. We need to have the amount of people across a variety of incomes to be able to, really have care, as that population continues to age. As we go forward, right, in addition to the household, that we're seeing, we're also seeing actual population loss, right? I think everybody can understand to have a vibrant economy, to have, workers, to have, a variety of incomes, in your environment. We need to have at least a little bit of growth. But when we look at the last decade, we've actually seen significant negative population loss when you look at the full-time population of the Cape, okay? And obviously that has, significant implications as it relates to the job market, right? So I just want to make the point that, again, COVID, a significant disruption. This environment lost about 11% of total employment during 2020, okay? And so just to put that in perspective, that's 11,000 jobs that completely and totally went away during COVID. Right. It's not different than what we've seen in other submarkets in the United States, right? Obviously, huge disruption, leisure, hospitality, retail, trade, all those issues that you couldn't go into your living room and be on Zoom. But, when we look at what is, happening thereafter, right, the United States as a whole got back to our pre-COVID peak employment in August. OK, those numbers don't August this year, those numbers don't happen in the Cape until 2026. Okay, this is not from a lack of demand. And a lack of economic, ability or mobility. It's really from a challenge around where those workers can live and the labor force that exists, on the Cape for those key employment types, right? The biggest disruption, when you look at it, interestingly, a component of growth across so many of the submarkets in the United States is that education and health service, right? This is not an industry cluster or cohort that we as a community can afford to give up, right? We need to teach our kids and we need to care, for our loved ones as they age, right? So as we talk about the disruptions from an economic perspective, the graph in the bottom right here is the one I want to point your eye to, right? As we see a disruption, in the current, housing availability system, this means that people have to drive, right? Drive much farther from a place of employment. So if we look at the last decade, effectively, you've seen a 20% growth in the number of, workers that are driving over 50 miles to get to their place of employment. Right? Clearly, this has traffic implications. It has timing implications and hiring implications. It means that workers become more expensive. And by the way, there's a significant climate change impact as well with all of those vehicle miles traveled. Right? So this is something that we need to do better at, delivering housing more proximate to employment and not requiring those individuals to commute those kind of distances. Right? In fact, this is a map for the actual employment within the Cape in terms of where they're coming from, right? The location of home. And you can see how far afield nowadays, those individuals are commuting from, okay? And obviously it results with increasing traffic, right? So we have a situation where we don't have, in the end, a return to peak employment, right? We have significant challenges from a growth perspective. And yet when you look at the bridge traffic, right, we hit high numbers in 2021 versus nothing ever seen before, right? And this problem will continue to compound, okay? So as we talk about sort of what's happening here, right, we like to check in on sort of the pace of housing development. We'll talk about this in a second as well as what's happening from a vacancy perspective. And the way that data is collected in terms of vacancy is not just sitting there vacant, but also, that kind of key category here, which is vacant for seasonal, occasional, or recreational use, right? And we've clearly seen that climb as we look at the last decade, not just during COVID, right? But exacerbated during the last 36 months, again, given the pace, of change, on the economy as a whole. Okay, so we have seen a growth in overall housing units, but the growth in the vacancy, right, predominantly from that seasonal or recreational or occasional use, has overwhelmed the amount of net new housing that's been created. Okay, and when you look at this, it means that we're seeing a significant change in the data. Okay, in terms of year-round owner and renter occupied units, and where we think that goes moving forward. Okay, so in 2010, there was 98,000 year-round owner and renter occupied units across the whole of Barnstable County. Okay, that number, when we look at the forecast through 2029, is 91,000. We are losing those units, right? And we need to do a better job in terms of the housing market as a whole to be able to, generate all of those kind of key metrics that we were talking about earlier. Okay. This will be relatively straightforward as it relates to, the existing housing stock. But, when we talk about sort of demographic, destiny in our country, what we have in terms of, these major components, the baby boomer, of course, and their kids, the echo boomer, the millennial, we need a wider variety of housing types, right? And when we look at this market today, not a surprise, 81% of all of the housing product type is a single family detached unit, right? That means when we look at the construct, right, and the pricing dynamics, when we look at sort of, the ownership to rentership rates, and obviously what that means from an entry price point and entry, income, let's be very honest, you really have to, in today's market, be making, roughly speaking, $200,000 of household income to be able to buy something on the Cape, right? And I just want to make this point, right? When you look at what has occurred this year, okay, with the interest rate expansion that we've seen, you cannot overemphasize the disruption that this has in terms of housing costs, right? I mean, we are really fully squarely into the 8% range in terms of new mortgages, right? And so if you combine the home price appreciation that Elisa talked about around everybody in this room's home equity, right, given the amount of owners that we have, in addition to that interest rate change, we are talking about a housing cost that, for all intents and purposes, has doubled in the last 24 months, right? And so again, what's happening here is we're excluding key components of the population, right? We're excluding people that would love to move here and be the workers and the sort of vibrant economy that we need on a go-forward basis, but don't have any prayer to make that work, right? And then we talk about housing creation writ large. So this bar graph is relatively straightforward, right? It's total housing production going all the way back to 1980, right? And what we saw in the 80s and 90s is 2,000 to 4,000 units a year produced every single year, on the Cape, okay? For the last decade, that's been 500 units, right? We've seen this decline, right, in all of our communities, and we need to reverse this trend as it relates to overall production. Okay. And so, I sort of made some of these points here already, but we've seen rents grow way faster than incomes, right? And I want to talk a little bit about incomes as well, because, so many times when we look at, income ranges and we look at the growth of those incomes, the growth of housing costs, and they're in a little bit more alignment than you feel and you think, we need to talk about the composition of those incomes, the data that's actually being reported. Right? Because a median income, if you remember elementary school stats, it's the 50th person in a line of 100. That's it and that's all, right? And so as we see the displacement of lower income people and the growth happening all at the top end of the scale, that median income is moving, in some cases extremely fast. But that doesn't mean that the wages or the income earning potential of some of our most at-risk households and individuals is moving at all. Right? One of the key trends over the last decade has been the have and have not, the wage stagnation of service employees, of retail employees, of healthcare employees relative to the overall mix of incomes as a whole, right? And so there's a situation where individuals and households, even in an environment where incomes are growing, are not seeing more purchasing power. Right. And when we actually look at the conversation around home ownership and then think about, these points, as I go forward, right, a 90% increase in housing costs when you combine interest rate increases and home price appreciation, right? Those two key components, affordability, continue to price out those key components of our economy. Right. And so as we think about, the rental situation as an alternative, right? Again, very, very few rental units that exist within this environment. Full-time rentals have been converted into short-term rentals. I work in so many communities around the United States, Jackson Hole, Bend, Oregon, Vail, right? You can go through these environments. There's one of those where there are 3,800 total rental units that exist in that market, 3,700 of which sit on Airbnb, right? So the conversion into that short-term rental product has been extremely striking. And what's left from a 12-month rentership perspective is far in excess from a pricing perspective versus what those incomes, even family incomes, even 3 and 4 person family incomes can afford, right? We are in crisis, okay? In addition to the doom and gloom, and sorry for that, there are benefits to housing development, right? In addition to creating a vibrant economy and, having places to live for our kids and their kids over the longer term, the reality is that housing development creates all kinds of positive externalities that we need to at least give some voice to, right? And so this is in the report where we actually do some math around a hypothetical 250 unit apartment building and what it does in terms of property taxes, in terms of jobs, in terms of all those kind of downstream implications. But I just want to nod to that for a second, right? Remember, there's new jobs that are created, both permanent and construction, the spending power that comes from retail sales, right? From those new residents, the Keynesian multiplier where that dollar that gets spent in the local economy continues to get spent in the local economy, right? So we need to think about those, softer benefits of housing development, right? As it relates to, again, that vibrant local economy. And of course, the real fiscal benefits as well, right? The sales tax spread to the local communities, property tax benefits, right? All of those environmental benefits that we get from CO2 reduction as we're able to get people closer to their jobs that we need to be in. And then, by the way, a situation where when we look at dynamic mixed use cities and neighborhoods, there are real premiums that accrue by walkable, desirable, first-ring suburban downtowns, right? That continue to push, values for the existing residents. Okay, so that's what I wanted to present today. Sorry for the doom and gloom, but in the end, questions, comments, etc. I'm all ears. I think there's probably some mics around that we can talk about, and we go from there. So, I guess hands. Anybody have any hands? There's one.
Are your slides going to be made available to those attending?
They are. In fact, these slides are excerpted from what is a 90-page report with a whole bunch more data that we get way too into the weeds. But yes, is the short answer to that.
We'll send it out to everybody, and it's on our website.
Elisa says everyone will receive a copy, and it's also on the website already, I believe, right?
Yeah, sure. That sounds great. Sure. Hi, thank you. Thank you for that presentation. It's very informative. So I have one question for you. I know you're from California. You're here in Barnstable County. Most people in this room, we spend an enormous amount of time talking about this with each other, with our constituents, our chamber members, etc. But I think everybody knows one of the biggest issues here is zoning and wastewater. So how do we deal with the town meeting form of government that pretty much constricts all that growth? And that's really what I think we need solutions for. So I'd like to get a little feedback from you on how you think we can work together to get, like in my town in Falmouth, which has 240 odd representative town meeting members who pretty much decide everything that has to do with zoning and budget, how we get that few number of people to really understand what's happening here.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just say that's what we're here for today, right? So I think, look, yes, I trade in the data and the dorkitude. That is absolutely true. Like, I try to get to a place of facts on top of which we then need to have advocacy, policy, training, more conversations, greater communication of those facts, etc. That's what we're here to do. Yeah. Yeah, Mike. So I let them. Yeah. Go ahead, please go ahead.
Oh, all right. So I just kind of curious about the where we stand not right now. What would be the trajectory if we continue at this pace? And what would you there's got to be a first, second, third thing you would look at as saying, what can we do to make a difference?
Yeah, I mean, look, for me, again, having looked at these markets that are further down the path, right, of, housing crisis, and having lived in one for now multiple decades, the reality is, more housing however we can do it, right? And I think there's a really important conclusion in our report, which I would recommend, everybody reads at some level, is that, we can't just deliver affordable housing, capital A affordable housing, right? There are solutions to deliver 60, 70, 80, 90% of median income type of housing. Now, there's some real problems around that, around a median income that's growing, right? And wage stagnation for specific humans, okay? So there's some disconnects that exist in that environment. But we have mechanisms to do that, right? The big problem that continues to develop in so many of these markets down the path is the true missing middle. And that missing middle ends up getting wider and wider and wider and deeper, right? And so, look, there is just a simple reality. We live in a market economy, right? The most affluent people win. It's not politically very, great to say that, but in the end, if you deliver 500 units of housing, right? But there's 1,000 units of demand every year, the most affluent 500 people win. And how they win is pay more for it, right? So what that means is that we need to continue to develop housing of multiple product types, right? To think about density in a smart way, to think about, where we can go, to this point around, physical challenges, to deliver housing across a variety of income types, right? There's a big sort of point that I need to make, that market rate housing is affordable housing in the long scheme of things, right? So there's the call to action, is as much as we can build in a responsible and smart way is what needs to happen, right? Go ahead. Sorry, go for it. Yeah.
Lois Andre, Dennis Chamber of Commerce. Has there been any study in relationship to towns get money from the short-term rental tax? And in your information, you talked about the value of the housing and putting money back into the economy. How can you quantify the difference between the towns are getting a lot of money in relationship to the short-term rental tax?
Sure.
Okay, how would that translate differently if those units became rental units, year-round rental units, in relationship to the amount of money that a town can pull in?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't done the math, but it's arithmetic, right? I mean, so there's a level of actual fiscal benefit from any given development, right? And that just needs to be compared to the existing, short-term tax. But again, I'm not talking about a substitution effect. There's a yes and part here as well. Right. Sorry. Yeah, go for it.
Thank you so much. I'm Laura Silber from Martha's Vineyard. I'm here with a contingent from the islands. Thanks for having us. So my question is, I'm hoping today we can also talk about prevention of the loss of year-round inventory into the seasonal market. On the islands, we have no way of building ourselves out of this. The Army Corps of Engineers is launching a carrying capacity study for both islands, which we hope to have completed in a year. I think the Cape is trending in the same direction. Market rate housing on the islands is unfortunately not affordable or attainable housing. Our median is approaching $3 million on Nantucket. It's approaching $2 million on Martha's Vineyard. And there reaches a point where market rate housing it's simply not affordable or attainable housing anymore. So I was wondering if that was, I read the summary of the report, but not the data and stats. And I'm wondering if you could either speak a little bit to that, or if we could, or if someone else could.
Yeah, I would say a couple things to that. First is, when I say market rate is affordable housing, I don't mean that the units sold on the market are affordable, right? That's not what I mean by any means. In fact, in many cases, we're talking about far out of reach, right? As the examples on the islands really would tell us. But what I'm talking about is a choice, is a future choice of, do you want to have further and more significant price appreciation, or do we want to slow that curve, right? Because again, in the end, the amount of demand that shows up with the wealth that exists there now, right? I mean, there's so many data points around wealthy, collecting more and more homes, right? The fact that so much of the economic power is accrued to a very select group of people, right? What that means is that they will always have the money to continue to bid up what's existing there now, right? And so it's really a trajectory change, right? I think that there's a bit of a false where there's a paradox here. There's a false choice, right? And I've dealt with this in my community for a long period of time. it's not that we can take where we are today and see significant pricing declines. I don't think anybody wants that, right? It's really about changing the trajectory. So when I say market rate housing is we know the market and the demand is going to be there, right? The only way to bend that curve down to a much more normal, much more healthy pace of appreciation is to deliver enough, right? But I mean, the land lock, the physical capacity, all those things are a big issue, right? And so that's a matter of thinking about specifically for the Cape, smart type of development in town areas. How do we think about density that's appropriate? I think there's going to be some conversations about that to come. Okay. Yeah, so go ahead.
Hi, thank you for your statements and your presentation, and a special thank you to Hack. I'm the chair for the Barnstable No Place for Hate. And one of the key issues in regards to housing that we've been addressing is the racial issue. Somewhat that's apparent in our discussion today. And what I'm talking about is the lack of affordable, low-cost housing. We don't have a definition of affordable. What is it? We use the term, and I would love to hear how that's been defined in other jurisdictions across the country. But in addition, it's the role of government. I think it's really important that Senator Sear and others, legislative members of the delegation are here. But the town council also plays a really important role. So hearing from you how, in fact, you pulled together the various sectors of government, because without that, today's meeting is a great beginning, but we need the administrative governmental coordination to keep this going and recognize the financial factor. So I thank you.
Agree, good comment. And I think that's, again, why we're here today. So.
Hi there. I'm a landlord myself, and I heard both of you guys talk about the fact that many long-term rentals are being converted to short-term rentals, with the implication, and I think even the explicit statement, that that's more lucrative for the owners. My experience has been the opposite, that year-round rental is actually more profitable than short-term rental. I think that the drive for this conversion is second home ownership, right? I want to have a place at the beach. I want to use it July 4th week, and then I'll keep it rented out the rest of the summer to help pay my bills. And so what the short-term market has done is make second home ownership more attainable for a larger group. And I think that's where the conversion is really coming from. So,
yeah, by the way, I agree with that statement. That
was my first question. Do you agree, or am I seeing it wrong?
No, I think that's a very strong, context to give, right? And I mean, the thing that's really interesting, and by the way, just to be totally honest, it's messing with the data a little bit, right? And everybody's impression of it all, but seasonal rentership, vacations, vacation at home ownership, right? Where you actually call your primary house has changed probably more in the last 36 months than any period in American history, right? And so there's some nuance in here that I think is important to voice. But again, I would say there's a yes and point, right? Is that we see that, moving multiple directions, right? So yeah, thanks for your statement.
Yeah, and my simple follow-up, which I think you kind of touched on, is if we want to understand in that context, in that more nuanced way, then what do we do, right? Because I think it's trickier for the market on its own to solve that. If you make more money renting year-round and you're still not renting year-round, then what?
Right. I think we're done. Sorry, everybody. I'm around, so more questions, I'm more than happy to. So.